Obviously, Jordan unhappy with these plans to potentially annex parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. What is Jordan most concerned about, really? Is it losing land, or is it the king's already shaky status in his own nation?
So there are a few things at play when we look at Jordan. For instance, when you talk about the king's face towards his people, we're looking at a population that's about 60% of Palestinian descent. So any collaboration with Israel is looked at by that population aggressively, not popular at all. Now, if we look at Jordan and its financial state, well, that is quite dire straits. Even now, today, we're seeing Jordan try to return to normal after imposing heavy restrictions because of the coronavirus, but much of Jordan's economy is based on tourism. So we know that any economy that was, and even before Jordan's economy wasn't great, was based on tourism and U.S. aid. Now, both those things are at risk these days. The tourism at risk because of coronavirus, the U.S. aid at risk because remember that the United States would be supporting Israel, likely in any of these actions for annexation. So really what we're seeing here is a Jordan that is caught between a rock and a hard place. Jordan and the king needs to appease his people. These moves would be unpopular. On the other hand, he doesn't really have a leg to stand on, either financially or otherwise.
It seems, Emily, that there have been a few moments in history, in recent history, where we could have predicted the tension in this relationship. Earlier in the year, we heard that Jordan will stop leasing 2 parts of land to Israel under the agreement, the peace treaty that they both have. So it's been in the works for quite a while, this fraying of tensions.
Yes, I've heard analysts refer to this as a ball that's rolling down a hill. These are a lot of series of unfortunate events in the relationship between Israel and Jordan. And if we look at some of those pinnacle moments in the past few years, a lot of them had to do with the relationship with the United States. When the United States decided to declare Jerusalem the capital and relocate the embassy, that also wasn't good for Jordan. But if we look at the king himself, he's quite an interesting character. He's managed to balance a lot of diplomacy, even when he thought that decisions by American administrations in the past weren't great. For instance, he opposed the war in Iraq, but was quite diplomatic about keeping relations with Kuwait and still refraining from really having criticism and imposing that criticism upon the United States. He tends to be quite the diplomat. Here, though, he's in quite a pinch. And one interesting moment that happened this year, kind of a reveal in the relationship between Israel and Jordan, is that actually Israel and Jordan also enjoy covert relations on the security front. One issue that came up this week is that an Egyptian source, announced to a lot of news agencies that 5 suspects were actually apprehended for trying to commit attacks against Israelis in the West Bank, and that Jordan would see them on trial. Now, that happened back in February. The admittance is coming just now, Israel not saying a word about it. We know that Israel and Jordan also enjoy intelligence sharing. Israel helps the king when he's looking at people who perhaps try to oppose him in his own country, and cutting off that relationship would also be dangerous for the king in terms of intelligence. But that's something that if he admits to, well, that's a covert relationship and not an overt relationship. So it wouldn't buy him any political points. But just another interesting point when we look at the multi-layered relationship that we see here between Israel and Jordan.
And that's a very good point, Emily, because we often discuss how a move forward with the Israeli annexation plans under the Trump administration's deal would hurt Jordan, and how the Trump administration stance is putting the Jordanian king in a hard place. But we often overlook that a fraying of the treaty between Jordan and Israel could hurt Israel as well, and you mentioned some of the ways how.
And there are those who are saying that it could also ripple throughout other places in the region, other places in the Middle East. If we see a cut of those actual security ties, and now we see Mahmoud Abbas threatening to do so, making good a little bit here and there. But if we actually see those security ties cut off, it could mean a risk for all of these different countries and an upscale and an uptick in violence. But again, we have to remember that the king in the past, in his 22 years, was also very skilled at fighting a lot of these Islamist undercurrents like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State. And so he's managed to be quite the diplomat again in balancing those relations with the United States, but also confronting a lot of those Islamist movements. Now, will he be able to continue to do so if Israel does make good on this promise and he's really facing domestic pressure in the kingdom? This might be his greatest test yet.
Well, fingers crossed that diplomacy